Thank you, Tom. And now it is my distinct pleasure to turn the microphone over to our most commanding chair of the Board of Trustees, General Jim Dubek.
Susan couldn't make it today, and that's too bad for us because we certainly would benefit, as we always do, from her comments, observation, and wisdom. My second admin announcement is to thank the Connolly Foundation and other donors for their generosity that made this meeting possible. So thank you very much. The topic of our first panel is a renewed vision, agility in a changing world. And on the panel with me is Mike O'Loughlin, to my left, your right, and David Melicon, my right, your left. Please, if I could ask you to review their bios on pages 19 and 18 respectively. I'll only add that Mike had been responsible for communications on the Roundtable staff. And although he's gone on to bigger things now at America, we miss you a lot, Michael, so thanks for being here. And David has been helping the Roundtable for some time now through our rebranding, messaging, and marketing process. And you'll see in his presentation and throughout the day the fruits of his labor. And we've profited, David, from your professionalism, so thanks. Thanks, too. So we'll get right to it. I'll start. We'll each talk for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then, depending on the time, we'll break into groups for a group discussion of the questions that are in your booklet. Check your badge, and your badge should tell you what table you're participating in. If you're at the wrong table now, no big deal. When we get up, just move to the right table. We'll talk for about a half hour at your tables, and then at 10:30, take a break. You don't have to memorize all this stuff. I'll make other announcements. At 10:45, though, we want to be back because we're going to Skype in Danny Casey from the Vatican, and due to timing issues, we want to make sure we're all seated by 10:45. So I'll start things off. Let me start with restating the title, A Renewed Vision, Agility in a Changing World. There are some assumptions behind this title. I'll list 4 of them. First, that leadership takes place between the space, or in the space between is and ought. Where a leader's organization is and where that organization ought to be, which of course means that the leader has to understand where his or her organization is and figure out where it ought to be and why. Because a leader can't really generate followers without explaining why the organization has to move in a compelling way. A leader without followers is, well, the Lone Ranger. Second, leadership is about figuring out how to move from is to ought, and to be complete and accurate, a leader can't usually figure this stuff out alone, which leads to the third assumption, that is, leadership is a collaborative effort. And then last, leadership is about putting structures and processes in place to manage and adapt initial decisions as the organization learns in the process and reality unfolds. There's no agility unless you have a sufficiently effective management structure and processes in place. So with this in mind, I want to describe what the Roundtable itself has been up to in the last year plus. Our initial 10 plus years were spent in 3 major categories: building trust in the Roundtable, creating a set of services and products that were properly adapted from the corporate world or the secular world so that they could fit in the church culture and the church needs, and then overcoming inertia with respect to systemic, transparent approaches to temporal management within the church. About 2 years ago, the staff and the board, as a result of our annual strategic review, realized that our strategic landscape was starting to shift. And some, not all, but some of what we were seeing is this. First, the demand for our services and products was going up. Standards for Excellence, Catholic 360, Executive Leadership Coaching, all demands going up. The toolbox also demand going up. The toolbox for pastors was being delivered not just in many places, and I would ask if you have an annual report and haven't looked at it, to find the map of the United States, which corroborates what we were seeing a couple of years ago in the expansion of the demand on our products. The toolbox was being delivered not just in many new places, but in several varieties to meet the specific needs of those who were attending. And seminaries started to come to us for discussion about how to incorporate temporal management into their programs. Esteem was starting to take off, and business leaders and clerical leaders from another nation had come to talk to us about replicating the roundtable approach in their country. And since then, 3 other countries have come to us with the same request. So all that came together when Pope Francis came to the scene, and of course his reform program and his pastoral example has just accelerated all of that and motivated so many of us, inspired so many of us to get on with reform and change and adaptation. So we could have concluded in the discussion, the board and the staff, that all this was evidence that what we were doing was good and right, and we should continue to do what we were doing. That might have been kind of the normal organizational approach, but the board made a different conclusion. The board decided that what we had to do was some serious thinking about where our organization was, where it ought to go. And the board set in place a year-long, very extensive strategic review. Some of the board and staff worked on our strategic plan and our priorities and our approach. Some looked at our organizational capacity, not just in terms of size and composition of our staff, but also as it was, but also what were the new skill sets and the new set of procedural disciplined processes that we have to put in place to meet this new landscape. And then others looked at our current financial status and projected future requirements. And in all, what we came to understand that organizationally, the Roundtable was entering a new period. We described it as moving from Roundtable 1.0, a kind of startup mode, to 2.0, and we defined 2.0 as accelerating the momentum that we saw building around the country and around the world. So to meet this new requirement, to make sure that we could both meet the demands that we were seeing and to do our part in the quote-unquote Francis effect, we came to several conclusions. One, we had to update or reaffirm our mission, vision, and guiding principles, which we have done. Second, we wanted to shift from an executive director to a CEO, and we're in the final stages of hiring a CEO. Don't worry, Carrie's not going anywhere. That's the point right down here. We also thought that we needed to create new directorates, a marketing directorate, a communications directorate, and a development directorate, which we've taken the preliminary steps and will move along those lines once the CEO is on board. We began the work on rebranding and remessaging, hence our new website, our new name, our new logo, our new tagline, and Dave is going to talk a little bit about that. We also wanted to expand our donor base and our foundation base and build a bigger set of philanthropic partners, which we have begun to do, but we still have some work to do on that. And the board decided that we wanted to create a leadership position and then give that person the responsibility to figure out what is the appropriate international partner mode so that we don't dissipate our focus in the United States, but again, do our part for the global church. And we intend to give that position to Carrie once the CEO is on board. So she will be very much still the face of our organization and involved in everything that we do. And last, we wanted to narrow the scope of our products and services during this transition from 1.0 to 2.0 as we take all these actions. And we're in the midst of every one of these changes. It's taken a bit longer than all of us would have liked, but we're dedicated to pick the right people. We're dedicated to see this through. And from our perspective, that's what agility in a changing world looks like. That rather than resting on laurels, an organization has to be willing, and that's probably the hardest thing, willing and able to see the changes in the environment, define the difference between where the organization is and where it ought to be, figure out how to make that move, and do that together with staff, board members, and partners, and then manage that move into completion. And through the management, always to be ready to adapt as necessary, because reality does not stand still. Just because we looked at and defined it once, at time T sub 1, time moves on and things change. So opportunities will pop up and obstacles will as well. So even if you're having success, our view is that agility in a changing world is a demand on all of us as leaders. And if an organization doesn't adapt constantly, well, Darwin starts looking at that organization. And at the very least, the organization will start losing its edge and perhaps its relevancy. So that's my take on the board, or on the panel topic. I'm going to turn it over now to David and then to Michael. David.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So I wanted to, I'd like to show you some of the brand work that we've been referencing and talking about. Some of it you already see. You see it in your name badges. You see it in the annual report that Jim just referenced. But I want to talk about it and talk to you about it, not just because I want to show you the work. I want to use that as sort of a leaping off point, because what we'd like to talk about today and what I'd like to offer you as you think about things like management and bringing those practices of good management into the church. One of those practices is how you reach all your stakeholders, how you connect with them. Words like marketing and other sort of brand building words, they seem like they belong to the commercial world and don't necessarily belong to us in the church. They actually do. It's the way that people interact today. It's the way that young people especially think. And even though we say young people, it's really all of us. We all react to brands in the same way. And so I wanted to use this as sort of a talking point on that to show you how this works. The first start in building a brand, when Jim talked about the space between is and ought, that really is what brand building is about. The first thing you have to do is you have to decide, what kind of organization are you? What kind of organization do you want to be? And then how do you get there? Because in a brand, you can message where you want to go as well as where you are. Those brands that sort of jump ahead and go to where they want to be without referencing where they are often lose people, right? Because they don't seem authentic. But if you start from who you are and where you want to go, you can build a strong brand foundation. So what we did with the Roundtable was figured out who they were and who they wanted to be. What you see up here are kind of the core principles of the brand. They became the brand, they're used in two ways. One is a foundation, a platform from which to grow, and I'll reference all the stuff that you're seeing, all of the physical manifestations of the brand, whether it's the logo or other things. But they also become filters. So what you see in this tool on the slide is that the Roundtable sees itself as it is today and as it wants to be, as a humble, powerful partner to the church. It's a humble, powerful partner to those it serves. What you see, you can't really read it from there, and that was the point is not necessarily to read the detail, but just to know that it's there. What you see to the right of each of those words is what that means. What that means and how then that becomes active. So there are questions that the staff and others, the board, can ask themselves. Is this how a partner would act? Is this what humility is in being a partner to those we serve? And by going through this process, an organization can actually figure out what its brand should be and how to build on that brand. The way that we've done it in some of the touch points you see today are things like the logo. The purpose of the logo is to obviously invoke some of the equities that the Roundtable already had, round table, that's pretty easy, to simplify the name, to create a tagline underneath that could convey what the Leadership Roundtable was about. So humble, powerful partner, that's who we are, but that's not necessarily what we say. We should just show that. And we show that by providing service, excellence, and church management. That's our tagline. The other thing that the mark does, it invokes a couple of different things. You can look at it different ways, and some people see it and they see the host. Some people see it and they see a pie chart. Some people see 4 factions of different sizes coming together. All of those things are true, and all of those things work depending on what you see. From that, we built, and I'm just showing you quickly some of the tools that we built, and this is just a cover of it, but it's a brand guidelines document that allows the staff and the board to use this to create other touch points. So what should our photography look like? How should we be talking? What's our voice as a staff, as an organization? All of those things are brand touch points that you have to bring to life. The brand touch point that I think is most key, though, and that I'm going to switch to now, give me a cover slide there so I can get to the internet. I want to show you the website, which is the most prevalent way that people are going to see us. So this is the #1 way that people are going to reach any of our organizations today. Whether you're a business, whether you're a church, we all know it. They're reaching us through their phones. They're reaching us online. And so we've got to be where our stakeholders are if we want to connect with them. That's why the website was really critically important. So when you go to the website and you look through some of the things, you'll see that we've got all of the background that you'd find on any website. For those of you who are long-term Leadership Roundtable constituents, you know that they've had several websites that are all connected. So we've tried to offer those in a way so you could, for instance, if you want Catholic Leadership 360, you're still going to find it here. If I've still got a good connection, you're going to find it. So you've still got the same, you've got all of the information that you would have had, but it's organized in a way that feels on brand. Some of the points, when you think about humble, powerful partner, that we decided, and this is where the choices that you make from a brand perspective are so important. We decided to go with original photography, so it's all photography that's been taken by the staff or developed by the staff. It's not stock photography. And we also decided to do certain things. So for instance, we show churches, but we show them from an angle, generally we're trying to show them from an angle that's looking above. So you generally see sky, so you feel, you put yourself in a position of humility to the church, which is in a position of power. At the same time, as you noticed on this, when we go back a page, for instance here, when you dive in, all of the photos include people. Because we really wanted, if you think about humble, powerful partner, there's a humanity there that we wanted to show. So it's not just organizational. Those things are what are right for the Leadership Roundtable. They're not necessarily right for every brand, every organization, but it's that sort of thinking. Everything counts, everything communicates, and it's that sort of thinking that really goes into building a brand. And that sort of conscious thought and rigor is something that we should all be giving to all of our brands, and that's one of the temporal points of excellence that we think that we need to start thinking about today, beyond just management. Thanks.
So before I begin, I just want to thank Carrie for inviting me to be back here. Like Jim said, it's sort of a family reunion. I worked for the Roundtable for about 5 years. It was my first job out of grad school. And I left a couple of years ago to go write for the Boston Globe to cover the Catholic Church. And now I'm headed to America to continue covering the church for them. And it was actually through America where I met Carrie. I was doing an internship there while in divinity school. And was introduced to Carrie, who has had an enormous impact on my career, so it's good to be back with you. I was asked to talk a little bit about agility and communications, and to highlight some examples of leaders in the church who lead with certain attributes that we might take to our own organizations. And before I get into that, I just wanted to share a quick story with you that does have a point, I promise. So a couple years ago now, I was sent to Rome to cover the Synod of Bishops on the Family. You might remember that this was this meeting that Pope Francis called of bishops from around the world to come to Rome and talk about family issues, some controversial issues, some contentious issues that if they were talked about before at all, it was kind of hush-hush, and now Pope Francis was bringing these issues out into the open and asking how the church can respond to modern family situations. So this was my first trip to Rome as a reporter, and going over as a professional and also as a practicing Catholic, it was a really moving week to be over there interviewing cardinals, learning how the Vatican works, getting to know some employees of the Vatican Bank, the Vatican bureaucracy. It was really an overwhelming week. Toward the end of the week, I found myself at dinner with a priest who works with Vatican officials. He knows the Pope. He has the ear of the Pope when he wants it. And we were at dinner not far from St. Peter's. We had had a couple glasses of wine, which in Rome is cheaper than a can of Diet Coke, which is nice. And as we were wrapping up, we realized that we were going in the same direction. My hotel was near where he was staying. So he said, let's walk together and I want to show you something. So we walked to St. Peter's and he takes me to a spot right in the middle. And for anyone who's ever been there, there's this kind of circular piece of concrete in the middle. And when you stand there, everything lines up perfectly symmetrical. So we're there on a beautiful October night. It's cool, crisp, clear. The dome of St. Peter's is illuminated behind us. The columns of Bernini are lined up perfectly. And it's a little emotional. This week has been a little overwhelming for me. And I have this priest here who says, Michael, I want to tell you something. So I'm getting a little, ready. Maybe he's telling me something about the Pope. There's this little bit of wisdom that I can think about on my long flight back to Chicago. He says, Michael, take a look around. And he points up at the dome. Nowhere else can you cram more dysfunction into 1 square mile. Welcome to the Vatican. And I tell that story for a couple of reasons. It sticks with me because I think it really sums up how I view the church in my own work. It's at once incredibly inspiring to countless millions of people around the world. It's how we connect with God, connect with each other, form our communities. And at the same time, it's dysfunctional in many ways. And the fact that you're all here because you're committed to improving that dysfunction, I think is a testament to your own faith, and it's inspiring to people like me who want to see the church thrive and survive. Now, that dysfunction is also a cause for concern for Pope Francis as well, and as many of you know, he's undertaken several reform efforts to improve the church's operations, including communications. The Vatican has a sprawling, if somewhat bumbling, communications program, and Pope Francis for the past year has challenged Vatican leaders to consider ways to use their resources more effectively to get the church's message out. And we're in the middle of that process now, and we're all, from the journalist side and from everyday Catholic sides, we're eagerly looking to see how the church might improve its communications efforts. So, speaking of the Pope, I returned to the Vatican about a year later, last October. Only by then, I had written a book about Pope Francis, which makes a great gift and is available wherever you can find books. It's called The Tweetable Pope. It's an examination of Pope Francis's Twitter account and how he uses social media to communicate the gospel and his own goals for his papacy. So anyway, this priest that I know had arranged a short meeting where I would be able to give the Pope a copy of my book and explain to him what it was all about. So during a coffee break one morning, we were whisked into a side room. We had about 20 minutes with Pope Francis, and as he was learning what the book was about, he started smirking. And he said that he was amazed I found anything of value in those tweets, that I could write a whole book about them, in fact. He went on to call it an interesting idea, which I think is a great papal endorsement for a book. But I tell that not only to plug the book, but because I think it shows how he leads. This is a man who is a self-described dinosaur when it comes to technology. He says that he doesn't know how to operate a computer. He has somewhat of a grasp on what social media is, but he certainly is not punching out his own tweets. And yet, he's risen to become the most influential global leader on Twitter in only a couple years, or 3 years now into his papacy. That means that his followers on Twitter are engaging his tweets at a much higher rate than other world leaders, while he has far fewer followers, about 30 million now, than people like Katy Perry or Justin Bieber. The Pope's followers are much more engaged. They want to share his message. They want to promote it to their own friends. They might think about what he's saying throughout the day. And I think that that shows he's confident enough to rely on advisors who say, you need to be out on social media. You don't know how to do it. We'll do it for you. And he says, go, do it. This is where we need to be. You'll carry out my message for me. So it takes that kind of confidence to know that you need to surround yourself with the right people who know how to get your message out for you. Now, when I was promoting the book, I was often asked if social media, what the impact would be for religion. Should the church be engaged in this sphere at all, or is it kind of damaging to the church to be out in the wild west of the internet? And I always laughed when I got that question because it assumed that we had a choice at all, that we could either engage with this or we can't. And my answer was always, Pope Francis himself says that we need to be where people are. We need to get out into the streets and be with people. Now that has a lot of layers and a lot of different meanings for sure, but for so many of us, where we are is on the internet. We spend so much of our time in front of screens, on our phones, computers. And if the church, if faith leaders, leaders of Catholic organizations aren't there, we're not with people. And the people will keep doing what they're doing in front of their screens, whether we're there or not. So we have this opportunity to engage with them, to evangelize, to draw them into our mission, to communicate, to listen to what they have to say in ways that has not been possible even a decade ago. People would ask, can you really get much across in social media? Whether it's Facebook or Twitter, you don't have a lot of space to get your message across, and some people think it's a bit shallow in the messages you can put out there. So I went to the Gospels, and I looked at some of Jesus's most well-known sayings. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They're all well below 140 characters. So my answer was always, if Twitter's good enough for Jesus, who are we to say no? So again, it's getting where people are, using social media perhaps in surprising ways. One of my favorite ways the Pope uses Twitter is to remind us to look up from our screen. So I get this message saying, engage with people around you as I'm zombie-like scrolling through my phone. So there are different ways we can use social media, but we have to be there because that's where everyone is. So pivoting a bit from social media to agility, I wanted to talk a little bit about how Pope Francis engages the press. As a journalist, it's kind of a godsend that how Pope Francis engages the press. And for anyone who pays attention to papal travel, you know that there's a little bit of a routine now. The Pope will fly to his destination, and then on the return flight to Rome, he'll hold a press conference. Now, depending on your point of view, these are either a blessing or a curse, because this is when Pope Francis is at his most candid. I think of just last week, for example, when he was flying home from Armenia, Pope Francis was asked by a reporter to respond to this suggestion from a German cardinal that the church should respond to gay and lesbians for past mistreatment. And he kind of got on board with it and said not only to them, but to women, to children, to exploited workers, to anyone we have not stood up for in the past, we owe an apology. Now, this drew huge headlines around the world, of course. Anytime Pope Francis kind of goes off script, it's great for journalists, not so great for Vatican communications people because they're trying to clean up the confusion that might be caused. But I think the press conferences where Pope Francis is at his most candid, they give us three lessons, I think, especially as we think about how to communicate with the press, people covering our organizations. The first is to be available. The fact that the Pope is willing to engage the press, even though it's somewhat, it causes some work for his advisors, that's an important step and one that the Vatican has not always embraced. The next is to be surprising. A lot of times we get frustrated that the press doesn't cover our work because we're doing really good things and people should know about it, but that's unfortunately not the nature of news. News is something that's new, that is out of the ordinary. That's what makes makes the headline. So be surprising. Pope Francis is always surprising during these press conferences, and the amount of coverage he receives is testament to that. And the third lesson is be human. It used to be that you could distribute a kind of whitewashed, bland press release and hope for some coverage, and it was all very by the book through committees, but that's not going to work anymore. Be human, form relationships, show that you know what your constituency or your flock is thinking about, and be willing to comment on them. So coming back to the United States a little bit, that's what I cover, the church in the United States. I wanted to highlight a communications aspect of a recent decision in the Archdiocese of Chicago, where I live. The Archbishop there, Blaise Cupich, who is a friend of the Leadership Roundtable, he announced a couple weeks ago that the Archdiocese would now offer paid family leave to new parents, whether you were giving birth or adopting a child, to all employees of the Archdiocese. And this came at an interesting time because the Archdiocese is facing a lot of challenges financially. Parishes will be closing, schools are closing, and this policy will cost $1 million a year. So it was kind of a delicate balance on announcing this great new policy while weighing the reality that the church there is struggling. And I highlight that not for the policy, which of course is good, but instead because the Archbishop there is pretty good at this communications game, and he realized that this policy, while great in itself, had a huge opportunity for the church there to tell its story. The announcement came through local Catholic media. It was picked up by local secular press. It was on all the TV stations. And then it kind of bubbled up to the national level, too. There was an NPR feature with an interview interviewing Archbishop Cupich a couple weeks ago. And I highlight that because you have to have your communications people around the table with you when you're making strategic decisions. If your model is to make a decision, then hand it off to communications, you've already lost. You need to have people there explaining how your decisions are going to impact your ability to tell your story, to broaden your reach, to engage more people. And as David was saying, this isn't a sleazy thing. This isn't something to play the press or play communications people to kind of build your own brand. Instead, it's a way to communicate your own message, which I think leaders of organizations have a duty to do. And finally, one more example of a more local leader engaging his flock well was following the shooting in Orlando a couple weeks ago. You might remember this happened early on a Sunday morning, very late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, so most of us woke up to the news. By then, several bishops, several faith leaders had already tweeted out or published on Facebook responses to that, kind of unfortunately what's become a script in these situations, sending thoughts and prayers, offering condolences to victims. But I think the fact that that happened on a Sunday was very important because their communications teams weren't with them in most cases. But they were agile enough to respond to the news themselves, or they were confident enough to let the team they had put in place respond to that news. And I think that's very important. And again, it's because as leaders, we owe something to the people who follow us, and we have to be able to respond in real time to what's going on in the world. Another response came from the Bishop of Pittsburgh. Is anyone here from Pittsburgh? Okay. So if you think of the Bishop of Pittsburgh at all, you might think of him as being the lead plaintiff in the Catholic Church's lawsuit against the Obama administration's contraception mandate, Bishop Zubik. Now, for many, that means he's squarely in one camp. He's a conservative. That's, we don't have a lot of time to think, so that's where he's going to be placed in our minds. But when he released his statement, it was notable for a number of reasons. He was one of only a handful of bishops to call attention to the identity of most of the victims. Most of them identified as gay, and he called for prayers for that community. He also went on a fairly lengthy and very strong theme of adopting stronger gun control laws. I think for a lot of people who cover the church, this was surprising because it showed that the church does not fit squarely into this left-right divide that we have. So he was surprising. He raised some eyebrows, and I think that, again, that's an important lesson for us here. So just to wrap up, I would say as we think about our communications, we need to be available, be timely, be surprising. I think that's one of the most important ones, be surprising, and be on social media. And when you're on social media, follow me at Mike O'Loughlin, and we can stay in touch. Thank you.
So we've got a few minutes before we have to break into our small group discussion to entertain any questions or comments or observations from the general audience for any of the panel members or for general consideration. I see people over there reaching for candy. Oh, Jeff.
I was just sort of curious in terms of both Mike and David's comments, and Jim, if you have one. What apps or media, social media networks? I mean, everybody sort of knows about Facebook and LinkedIn and some of the more initially more prominent ones, which, you know, those of us in business realize that, you know, they're sort of passé now. What are some of the names of social media apps or communication mechanisms are you seeing that we as church leaders should be thinking about using or interacting with in order to challenge the group in terms of our knowledge of it, and how do we go about finding out about these things?
Well, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's funny because I'm 30 years old, but I still feel incredibly old when I'm still trying to learn all these new apps, because it feels like the crowds are getting younger and younger on things like Snapchat and Instagram, and I'm trying to keep up on learning all those. So I think it's still important to have a presence on Twitter and Facebook. Twitter especially, I think, is underused because in terms of press, it's an essential tool for journalists. So that is where I get a lot of tips about stories, a lot of people responding to events that I then go to for further comments. So while it's kind of aging out and I think it's not as popular as it once was, it's still a professional tool that we need to be on to engage media. And then there's things like Instagram, which is great for brands to kind of promote themselves and engage with users. Snapchat is, for those who don't know, it's this technology where you can send photos and stories to people and they kind of automatically delete themselves after. And that, I think, is, David might know this, but that's kind of what is increasingly popular with younger people. So it's one of these things where you have so much resources, but you still need to be kind of on the cutting edge and experimenting with what's coming up next. So all these little dots on these banners, I think, are the bigger social media platforms. So you have to be present there and then keep an eye out for what's coming up next.
You want to cover the dots?
Well, we can cover the dots, sure. For those that haven't seen them, the social media things on the bottom are things like Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. We've got Vimeo and YouTube and Tumblr are all there. Or Flickr, not Tumblr. Michael's exactly right. I think the one thing I'd say, and Michael is a millennial, right? So he's one of those elusive things that we're all looking for in the marketing world. We're looking for millennials. But increasingly, marketers are also looking for the next generation, those the tweens that aren't actually millennials yet, because everybody wants to reach them and talk to them. I actually think, to your point, Jeff, I think you need to be, and I think this is building on what Michael was saying, you need to be on all these places. Doesn't mean that you want to diffuse, your message needs to be diffuse or you need to be scattered. It means that you need to know where people are going today. You need to know what they're doing, and more than that, and I think what Michael is really pointing out, is you need to know how they're consuming. The thing about Snapchat that I find fascinating is that, yes, the images do go away, but it allows you to track your whole day. And anybody that's a follower of yours or a friend of yours gets to see quickly in images or videos kind of what you've done. And more young people are thinking about this. They're broadcasting their day to their friends, and they're looking at their friends' days. So understanding that this is the way they're consuming media. Understanding, I mean, let's go to really old media. Let's go to TV. The fact that people are binge watching, the fact that people are taking control and looking at what they want to look at when they want to look at it is really important. So if you think about just the way they're consuming media and being there, I think it's important. I would not, we were talking about this in other conversations, you know, Facebook is definitely getting, the people on Facebook are older. The people on Facebook are in their 40s and 50s. That's becoming more and more the prevalent user there. that's still a place you need to be. That's still a community that you want to talk to. So it doesn't mean you stop talking to them. It just means you have to be open to all these new ways to reach people.
Yeah, Gino.
I might take a slightly contrarian question to Michael and to David, since we have communications experts here. There's a theory that says that all of these types of social media are really limiting people's ability to do critical thinking. And you quoted "Blessed are the poor in spirit" as the introduction to the largest, longest sustained discourse in the Gospels from the Lord. The Sermon on the Mount, I don't know. So it isn't 150 characters, it's 4 chapters, right? But in a Snapchat, Facebook culture where you're consuming tweets, how do we actually engage with the more substantial message of the faith, which may take more than 150 characters and takes lots of explicit reflection? Is it simply an entry point? And then that's how we get the crowds to do the serious reflection? Or do you believe it's actually part of a new apostolate?
Yeah, it's a good question and a challenge for sure. One of my responses to this kind of question is I think it's fairly easy for a lot of people to write kind of a lengthy essay or op-ed to try to get your point across. If you have several paragraphs, you can include a lot of sources and a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different people's thoughts and ideas. And I don't think that's difficult probably for anyone in this room to do. I think it's a lot harder to cut through all the noise and offer a few words that are going to stick with you throughout the day. So for me, we're constantly bombarded with information. And if Pope Francis can tweet something that sticks with me, I might think about it a couple times during the day, and then when I have more time, look up where that line came from. And then maybe by then I'm reading a longer document that he wrote, or I'm reading a piece of of church teaching that he's pointing to. So yeah, I don't think that we can shift away from preaching the gospel and doing our own kind of education about our faith and only follow people on Snapchat and Instagram and Twitter. But it goes back to my point that that's where we are. So we can't reject that reality. We have to be part of it. And I guess we're still figuring out the best way to invite people to take a deeper look into things.
I absolutely agree. I think it's way harder for anybody who's tried to write a tweet that's cogent. It's way harder to say something in 140 characters. But at the same time, I think you're addressing, a bigger issue in our society. People losing sometimes the ability to focus, that ability to go deep and to really have the attention span necessary. I think that in that way you can use this as an entry point. It's not going to solve. It's not going to solve that problem. It's not going to make people start to read weighty tomes if they're 14 years old. One of the things we learned for somebody else that we did some work for, I don't know, does anybody know what Global Citizen is? Global Citizen is an organization that does a concert every year in Central Park. Last year was Beyonce and Coldplay. We helped them launch their organization and their app. But what their app does is it allows young people mostly to earn points to get into a drawing to actually win a ticket to the Beyonce concert. The tickets aren't for sale. You have to actually earn your way into the concert. And one of the things we found, is that we would, the way you earn that, so this is in the marketing world, this is called gamification. The way you earn that is you have to go through something. So we wanted them to engage with the UN's Millennium Development Goals. And we'd send out white papers on things like women and girls. And we would ask them to read that. And there'd be a way, obviously, since they're reading on an electronic device, that we'd know if they'd read it before they got the points. Now, does that mean they absorbed it? They just flicked through the pages? We don't know. But the good news about this media is that you can learn what people are doing. That's also the scary part. But you know where they've been. You know what they've read. You know what they've looked at. You know which points of your argument or your article they're interacting with. And therefore, you can either give them more of that, or if they're not interacting with the right stuff, you can figure out a way to represent that to them in a different format. So I do think it's a learning, the technology is a learning mechanism for us, certainly as people who are trying to build organizations. And I think that's the good of it. The addressing the bigger issues of how to make people more contemplative in this world, I'm not sure about.
Well, There are a couple other questions. I wanted, as the dinosaur on the panel, I wanted to come back to Gino's question, because I'm also an author. I write normally 750 to 2,000 word op-eds or essays. I've written, quite a few, maybe 200 published essays and a couple dozen op-eds. At any rate, I find it very troubling that on the kinds of issues that I write about, generally national security issues, that the demand of the editors is less and less when the problems are more and more complex. And find that the medium is forcing less understanding, whereas the medium should force more understanding. So my conclusion from listening to both Michael and David in response is that we're not in the either-or world. That you've got a variety of mediums that we really have to leverage, and we can't push back on the longer kinds of understandings and writings, or we will lose quite a bit. So Darla, then Tom Bishop. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Peter Pursuti.
Okay, go ahead,
Mind
Peter.
if I just quickly ask or comment? I'm struck by, Jeff, you're thinking that the social media is a little passé or whatever, and what should we do? And I'm encouraged by what Mike is saying about the surprising and the human aspect. And I recall years ago being a leader in an independent school in Connecticut where we had several students arrested at JFK, and it was a crisis for us, and quite frankly, we skyrocketed as a result because we were the school of John Kennedy, and somehow they saw that, and we became very proactive about drug abuse, if you will. And I suppose that if there's anything I would advise is that maybe as dioceses and archdioceses, we think about these opportunities for healing, for the human touch, and all of these crises are opportunities, they're windows, and I think I applaud the Pittsburgh bishop for maybe doing that sort of thing. So the more you can be agile and start reaching out, because unfortunately, these things are happening all the time, and we need voices of folks who can help us filter through them, and our faith is one of those great wells of hope, if you will. So just a thought in terms of the opportunity, even for the roundtable, to be part of, to fill that void when these tragic events happen.
Thanks, Peter. We'll take three and then we'll break. There's Darla, Tom, and Bishop.
Well, that question that was asked previously sort of got to a lot of what I was thinking about. But the other thing the word that comes up to me with a lot of these apps is narcissism. I mean, that your whole life you're showing everybody your life every minute. And that's exactly the opposite of what, everything about the faith is about silence and being self-sacrificing. And I mean, I think it's interesting that one of his tweets is, look around you, get your face out of the phone. And I'm just thinking about how we can be reflective instead of buying into and trying to be just like everybody else on social media. How can you do it differently, still be active, but do it in a way that's not narcissistic and that emphasizes the way that we need to be, all the things that were brought up in the previous question. So I don't know that there's anything new you want to add to that, but that's...
No, it's a good point. It's a good question. I think you always have to be aware of what you're trying to do. Are you trying to build up your own brand, your own celebrity? Are you pointing back to yourself? Or are you using, in the case of Pope Francis, are you using your celebrity to point to something bigger and better? So for him, he has an Instagram account now, for example, and it's all pictures of himself. So is that narcissistic? Maybe. But it's pictures of him serving the poor, embracing the disfigured, being in places with refugees. So it's pointing to a bigger message. Do we live in a narcissistic culture? Probably. But again, I don't think we can separate ourselves from that, or we risk not being in front of people where they are. So it's using this kind of technology in a way to point to the bigger message. But it is a challenge, I'll grant you that.
But I also think that we run the risk, and Darla, I totally respect what you're saying, and given my age, I sometimes think it's very narcissistic as well, especially when I see some of the more popular people, in addition to the Pope, on social media. It seems that way. But I think we really risk something if we dismiss most of it as narcissistic. Because I do think the younger people that are spending time there, they're looking at it as a normal way of sharing. It's the way they're interacting. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it is an interaction for them that feels real. And so we have to get beneath that and understand that simple narcissism is not what it's about for a lot of the younger people that are on social media.
What you all have been talking about, and we've been spending a fair amount of time in our business trying to figure out how to reconcile what you've been saying, what we were saying up here about the social media and whatnot. And somebody said something to me a couple of weeks ago particularly in terms of trying to deal with the millennials and younger generation. We have, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, lost their trust. And they make, what this guy was saying to us is, they make decisions differently than we did. And when they're trying to comparison shop, they comparison shop among themselves. And the other insight that I got from this guy was that it is narcissistic, but it's a self-branding culture. And the reason why you have so many younger people going to concerts and things like that and taking selfies is to prove to each other that they actually were there, and it's part of a self-branding thing in the way that they communicate, think about things. And so there's a whole, if we want to regain the younger generation to the church, we've got to learn about this. And that's not to say that we dumb down what we do, but it's what you said. We have to figure out how to do it differently, to engage them in where they are, and try to reshape that and deepen it and bring it up. But I have to say, I myself, in all of the businesses that we've ever been in, we've always tried to figure out how to use technology as a mechanism to enhance the mission and the business that we're in. And that's all we're really trying to do here, is to educate each other and to expose each other, to that. But it's a very, both what Gino and you have said are an important part of the challenge. But I think what David and Michael have been saying is that we really do have to learn how the different generations learn and make decisions in order to figure out how to engage with them.
So Bishop Dowd, you have the phone, so go to you, and then Tom, you'll be the last guy.
Okay. Thank you. Bit of personal history. I was the first priest in Canada to have a blog. So I've actually been, and if you look at my back of my business card, it's got all my social media contacts on it. So I really believe in the importance of this. Little insight from my experience, if I may, and I think it touches on Gino's point and Darla's point. When the whole blogging reality started, it was very important for bloggers to know that they had people offering comments on their blog. They wanted whatever they put up there to initiate a conversation. When newspapers took over the blogging format, they started to use it with their newspapers. They wanted the same thing until they found out that a whole lot of those people put really nasty, disgusting, horrible things. And so you see a shift away from that. Either they don't do it at all, or they shift it to self-selecting groups like they use Facebook as the commenting medium. I bring that up because there are really two ways I've seen of using the social media. One is to push out a message, and I've heard a lot of that discussed today, how we use it to get out our message. But the second is how to create a community around a message. So you can tell which way the social media is being used, depending, in my experience, on what kind of commenting possibilities you find. If the commenting possibility is we don't want it, or we want it in the manner that we have to monitor the least, then it's really about pushing out a message. But when you see the person who puts up the original post then moderating the conversation afterwards, you're actually creating a community of engagement. around a particular message. It's extremely intensive, which is why once I was made a bishop, I actually had to drop that because I just didn't have the time in my calendar. But what people are looking for is both truth and empathy. I think the communities that people build around Snapchat, showing their friends to each other, that kind of thing, how many times when there's a crisis, suddenly the Facebook background image gets overlaid with the flag of France after the terrorist attack in Paris or what have you, or Orlando, the rainbow flag. They're looking to build communities of empathy, and they're asking each other, what should I think? Very few people are saying why you should think it. Actually engage the thought process. You can't, I don't think, like what Gino pointed out, how do you get people to start to think critically? I think you can in that medium, but only if you're willing to invest in the ongoing conversation. If it's about getting out a message and then moving on to the next message, then people will absorb it as, okay, this is yet another message that I'm supposed to absorb and figure it on my own, and they do what everybody else does. They talk to their friends and say, what do you think? If, on the other hand, we engage the message, a bit like teachers engage a classroom, with empathy, bringing truth with empathy, that shifts the whole nature of the conversation itself. It becomes more like the cocktail party we had last night. Where people wander around, they talk to each other, they meet each other, but they engage with each other. And so our social media effort, to the extent to which we see the difference between those two approaches, the pushing out the message will always be necessary, because crises will hit and people want to know what we think right away. They're already processing through all the stuff that's happening. But to the extent to which we're trying to initiate a conversation, that's where we've got to be willing to stick around and keep the discussion going and keep animating that discussion. So different tools are good for different aspects around that, but I think communities seeking truth with empathy, that's a key, I guess almost a kind of measurable you want to look at. And as I said, one of the factors I see is how we engage the conversation in comments. And I'll tell you, a lot of people read the comments. They won't read them if it's full of bile, because it's disgusting, they don't want to swim in that. But they will read the occasional angry comment if they see the angry commenter had a point. And what they look for is how you answer. And that's significant. I'll conclude with one quick story. I wrote a blog post once on the whole process of marriage annulments. And boy, did I get an angry response from somebody whose, marriage annulment, he had a whole crisis around that in his personal life. And it was really an angry comment, very. So I thought, do I delete it? Everybody will see that I deleted it, I'll have to explain why I deleted it. I might as well keep it up there. But then how do I engage it? How do I respond to it? And the manner of engaging it actually affected people more than the engagement in some ways. They said, Bishop, this person was hurting, but you engaged them in a way that was respectful. And most of the people who said that to me didn't say it on the blog because they were afraid of him blasting them. They just sent me private messages. But I realized there's an invisible community around these issues. It's about taking what's under the surface. There's an iceberg effect, We only see the top 10%, but the other 90% is there. That's the group we want to engage, but we got to do it by engaging them. Thank you.
Thanks, Bishop. And last comment from Tom, and then we'll break up.
I think the Bishop's comment was so thoughtful, I'm a little reluctant to follow after that. And I do want to change the topic a little bit to branding. And how does the church brand itself? And indeed, who thinks about branding the church and who creates the brand? It's difficult, and the Pope obviously doesn't have time to do that. And the anecdote I would give you, last week I had the pleasure of taking almost all of my grandchildren on a Disney cruise. Highly recommended to anybody who has grandchildren. But we went to an informal mass last Sunday, and the priest, who just happened to be on the boat with his family, in his homily talked about branding. And he said, look where we are, and look at Disney and the brand that Disney has created. and look at Mickey Mouse and what kind of a brand that is. And how should the Catholic Church think about branding? How can we, which is a much more powerful spiritual experience and world experience than Disney, how can we learn anything out of that in terms of how we are perceived and how we create perception of the church in the world, in today's world?
Well, actually, Tom, thanks for that, because that's a perfect lead into going down into group discussions.